I lost my job at 56. And if you had told me that a few weeks later I would be sitting here telling you that in some ways I actually feel better, I would have thought you were crazy because losing your job is supposed to be stressful. And believe me, the financial part of this has been absolutely stressful. But something else happened that I wasn't expecting. My anxiety started calming down. The constant fatigue that I had been dealing with started lifting. Even physically, I started noticing that I just felt different. And eventually, I had to ask myself a question that I really wasn't prepared for. How much was that job costing me that I didn't even realize? What's up to my favorite bunch of beauties? If you are new here, I am Denise, and here on Beauty Over Age, we talk about navigating this stage of life, the changes, the choices, the starting over, and all the things nobody really prepares us for. And if you've been here for a little while, then you already know that I recently lost my job. I talked about that when it first happened. But now that I've had some time away from it, there's another part of the story that I wasn't expecting. Because I thought that leaving that job was going to make me feel worse. Instead, in some ways, I started feeling better. And that realization has been interesting. I want to make something clear from the beginning. I did not wake up one morning, dramatically quit my job, and walk out into the sunshine and say, I am choosing myself. That is not what happened. I lost my job. It wasn't my choice. And when something like that happens, especially in your 50s, you immediately start thinking about the practical things: income, bills, insurance. What happens next? Am I going to have to find another job? Do I even want another job? Can I afford not to? All of that was very real. So I'm not trying to romanticize losing a job. There are parts of this that have been scary. But while my brain was busy worrying about all of those things, my body seemed to be having an entirely different reaction. The first thing that I really noticed was the fatigue. For a long time, I had gotten used to being tired. And when you felt a certain way for long enough, eventually it just becomes your normal. You stop asking why and you just build your life around it. You rest more. You push through when you have to. You cancel things when you can't. And you start assuming, well, I guess this is just how I feel. But after I stopped working, that overwhelming fatigue started easing up. Not completely, not magically, but enough that I noticed. And then I noticed the anxiety wasn't quite as loud either. I wasn't waking up with that same sense that I immediately had something that I needed to deal with. There wasn't always somewhere that I had to be mentally, something I needed to answer or something that was waiting for me. And I started thinking, oh, maybe I wasn't just tired. Maybe I had been carrying a lot. And I think that's the part that has stayed with me. Sometimes you're functioning, you're getting up, you're going to work, you're handling your responsibilities. So from the outside and even to yourself, you think, I'm okay, I'm handling it. But handling something and being okay are not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes you're carrying something because you've learned how to carry it. That doesn't mean it isn't heavy. And I didn't fully understand how much strain I had been under until some of that strain was suddenly gone. That was probably the biggest surprise. And if you're in a season where you're reevaluating your life, starting over, or simply asking yourself what you want the next chapter to look like, go ahead and subscribe to Beauty Over Age, because that is exactly what we're talking about over here. What happens when you realize that midlife isn't just about getting older? Sometimes it's about getting honest. And that is exactly what I've had to do. I actually talked about this with my therapist, and I told her that I had since noticed that after losing my job, some of the things that I was struggling with seemed to be improving. The anxiety, the exhaustion, just the overall way that I felt. And even saying it out loud felt strange. Because on paper, this should have been one of the most stressful periods of my life. I had lost my job. I didn't have another one lined up. I didn't know exactly what I was going to do next. And yet, there was also this sense of relief. And those two things can exist at the same time. I can be worried about money and still be relieved. I can wish I hadn't lost my job the way I did and still recognize that something needed to change. I can be uncertain about what's next and still know that I don't want to go back to exactly what I had before. That's been a big realization for me. And I want to be careful here. I am not saying that every physical symptom I've ever had was caused by my job. I am not saying leaving a stressful situation suddenly fixes your health. And I am definitely not telling anybody watching this to quit their job tomorrow. That is not the point. I'm simply paying attention to what I've noticed in my own life. When one major source of a daily pressure disappeared, I noticed changes. And I think that's worth paying attention to. Because our bodies sometimes give us information before we're ready to hear it. I have also had to rethink what success means to me. For a long time, having a good job meant security. You work, you make your money, you pay your bills, you do the responsible thing. And there is nothing wrong with that. But I'm 56 now, and I'm asking different questions. Not just how much money can I make, but what is my life actually going to feel like while I'm making it? How much of myself am I willing to give to a job? How do I want my days to look? How much control do I want over my own time? And what kind of work gives me energy instead of taking every bit of it? And those questions feel much more important to me now than they did at 30. When I first lost a job, I thought that the biggest question was, what am I going to do now? But I think the bigger question has become, what am I not willing to go back to? Because starting over isn't really starting over if you rebuild the exact same life that wasn't working for you. And I don't have every answer yet. I still don't know exactly what this next chapter is going to look like. I don't know whether everything that I'm building right now is going to turn into what I hope it will. There is still uncertainty, but there is also something I didn't have before. Space. Space to think, to create, to ask myself what I actually want. And maybe even space to hear what my own body has been trying to tell me. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that everything happens for a reason, because sometimes things happen and they hurt. Sometimes things happen unfairly. Sometimes something ending creates a very real problem that you still have to solve. But I do believe we can ask, what is this showing me? And losing my job showed me something I might not have been willing to see while I was still working there. I had gotten accustomed to a level of stress and exhaustion that I shouldn't have had to accept as normal. And now that I've experienced what it feels like without some of that pressure, that information I can't unlearn. So, if you're watching this and you've gone through some kind of unexpected ending, a job, a relationship, a role you've had for years, anything, I don't think you have to turn it immediately into some beautiful inspirational lesson. Sometimes it just sucks. But after the dust settles, it might be worth asking yourself, how do I feel now that I'm no longer carrying that thing? Not how you think you're supposed to feel, but how do you actually feel? Because the answer might be telling you something. Losing my job was not the way I would have chosen to begin this next chapter of life. But now that I'm here, I'm paying attention. And I don't want to rebuild a life that requires me to ignore myself just to maintain it. I would love to know if you've ever experienced something similar, where something ended that you initially thought was terrible, but once you had some distance from it, you realized there was also a little bit of relief. Tell me about it in the comments, because I have a feeling I am not the only woman who's experienced this. Until next time, keep choosing your power, protecting your peace, and I will see you next video.